Was the founder and CEO of a billion-dollar company, until the woman who married my son took everything. At a board meeting I built from scratch, she looked me dead in the eyes and said, "We don't need outdated people anymore." And then she fired me, while the room applauded. Sabrina Malik had never been one to chase the spotlight. 30 years ago, with nothing more than a second-hand desktop and a bold vision, she started Malik Innovations from her cramped garage in Austin, Texas. Back then, no one believed a woman in her late 20s, a single mother at that, could compete in the tech industry. But Sabrina didn't need their belief, she had her own. Day after day, year after year, she toiled. Sleepless nights, empty bank accounts, and failed prototypes filled the early years. But she never gave up. She'd poured every ounce of her soul into building Malik Innovations from scratch. From a modest garage startup to one of the nation's most respected tech companies, known for AI solutions in healthcare and finance, Sabrina had fought for every inch of progress. The company wasn't just her career, it was her identity, her legacy, and in many ways her family. When her only son Ray married Tessa, Sabrina welcomed the bright, ambitious young woman with open arms. Tessa had a corporate background in operations and marketing, and her ideas were modern and bold. Sabrina, now in her late 50s, thought it might be time to step back just slightly and allow some fresh thinking into the business. So 2 years ago, she appointed Tessa as Chief Operating Officer, a powerful role that involved working directly with Sabrina on company strategy, team structure, and investor relations. At first, everything seemed to be working smoothly. Tessa brought in consultants, trimmed inefficiencies, and restructured several departments. Sabrina admired her confidence, even if she sometimes felt out of sync with her fast, flashy style. They had their disagreements. Sabrina was methodical, data-driven and values-based. Tessa was rapid, aggressive, and image-focused. Still, Sabrina kept her faith in family. She believed Tessa's ambition could be shaped into something good for the future of the company. But she didn't see the quiet meetings, the late-night dinners with board members, or the sly reshuffling of shares. She didn't see the charm-offensive Tessa launched on the younger investors, nor how she subtly painted Sabrina as past her prime in internal discussions. Sabrina was too busy mentoring junior engineers and finalizing the new product line. Then came the company's annual board meeting, a grand event, streamed live for employees across the country and attended by media partners and analysts. Sabrina had prepared a keynote speech she hoped would inspire a new generation of innovators. Dressed in her signature navy pantsuit, she walked into the boardroom brimming with pride, unaware of the storm that awaited her. The meeting started normally. A few routine presentations, a highlight reel of the year's progress, and then it was Tessa's turn. Sabrina leaned back, expecting her daughter-in-law to give a short operational update. But what happened next shattered everything. Tessa stood, composed and radiant in a crimson blazer, and cleared her throat. "Before I begin," she said confidently, "I'd like to announce a major leadership transition. Effective immediately, I'm stepping in as the new CEO of Malik Innovations." Gasps rippled through the room. Sabrina's hands froze on the polished mahogany table. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tessa smiled, calm, cruel, calculated. "The board voted last week. The transition is official and unanimous."
Unanimou. The word it like a ponch tous gut.
Sabrina turned toward the board members she had mentored, supported, and promoted over the years. Most of them avoided her gaze. One gave a weak nod. Another stared at his tablet. "You knew," Sabrina said, her voice now trembling, not just with disbelief, but with betrayal. "And frankly," Tessa continued, "it's time. This company can't be run with outdated ideas and emotional decision-making.
Innovation demande évolution."
She paused, then added with a smile that made Sabrina's blood run cold, "Thank you for your service." The board clapped. Cameras clicked. Somewhere, an employee livestream typed OMG in the comments. Sabrina stood up slowly, her heart thudding in her chest. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Her life's work, her sweat, her tears, her sacrifices, was being torn away in front of the entire company, in a moment so publicly orchestrated that it felt more like a takedown than a transition. Tessa turned back to the room and resumed her presentation like nothing had happened. Sabrina, still standing, felt the world blur around her. In that moment, she wasn't the visionary founder of Malik Innovations. She wasn't even the CEO anymore. She was just dismissed. By her own family. In her own house. And everyone applauded. Sabrina drove home in silence.
No radio.
No tears. Just a deafening stillness inside the car, as if the betrayal hadn't just wounded her, it had hollowed her out. The sun had set by the time she pulled into her driveway. The familiar creak of the gate didn't comfort her like it used to. It echoed now, lonely and sharp. Inside the house, everything was exactly as she'd left it that morning, her half-drunk cup of coffee on the counter, the blue folder containing her keynote address still resting on the dining table.
The speech she never got to give.
She sat down heavily in her kitchen chair. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her phone.
She dialedrait, her only child.
It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. She tried again. Nothing. No text. No explanation. No support. He knew, she thought bitterly. He had to have known. Ray had always been quieter than her, gentle, tempered, and more interested in music than business. She never forced him into Malik Innovations. He had chosen that path when he married Tessa. But now, silence from her own son felt like the deepest cut of all. By morning, the headlines were everywhere. Power shift at Malik Innovations, Sabrina Malik out, daughter-in-law in. Generational transition or corporate coup. Tessa Malik ushers in new era of leadership. Some articles were respectful, calling Sabrina a pioneer or visionary founder. But the tone had already shifted. She was being framed as the past, graciously stepping aside to make room for the future. No mention of the ambush. No mention of the betrayal. Even her LinkedIn account was flooded with cold congratulations and subtle condolences. Wishing you well on your next chapter. Thank you for your years of service. Excited to see what Tessa brings to the table. It was as if her entire identity had been erased overnight. She spent the day in a haze, ignoring the calls from reporters and the one message from a former assistant asking if she was okay. Sabrina stared at the television without watching it, the volume muted, while her mind churned. By evening, she wandered into her study. Dust had settled on the bookshelves, rows of journals, company records, and her own handwritten notes from the early days. She pulled open the bottom drawer of her old desk and found a worn navy blue notebook. Her very first strategy journal. She sat down, flipping through pages filled with timelines, investor lists, vision statements, and contracts. And then suddenly she stopped. Her eyes landed on a clause she had written over 2 decades ago, an obscure but binding term nestled deep in the original articles of incorporation.
The silent equity clause.
She had almost forgotten it. The clause had been her insurance, crafted during Malik Innovations' infancy when she had brought on her first 2 angel investors. To protect herself, she'd inserted a stipulation that granted her a unique equity position, non-voting but protected shares that couldn't be diluted or revoked unless the company bought them out at market value, adjusted for future potential, not current standing. The kicker? Those shares still accounted for 17% of Malik Innovations. No one had touched the clause in years. It was too obscure, buried under legal updates and share restructurings. Everyone had assumed Sabrina had relinquished those rights when she transitioned to CEO instead of sole owner. But she hadn't. And she never would. Her fingers tightened around the edges of the notebook as a flicker of purpose sparked behind her eyes. She wasn't powerless. Not yet. The board might have turned their backs. Tessa might have orchestrated her public humiliation. But Sabrina still had teeth, and she still knew this company better than anyone. The silent equity clause gave her more than just financial leverage, it gave her a voice. A strategic opening. Not to beg. Not to sue. But to reclaim. Sabrina stood, sharper than she had been in weeks. She pulled out her laptop and began a new document. Project Revival. Bullet points followed quickly, legal reviews, loyal employees who might still respect her, media contacts who owed her favors, technical flaws in the company's current trajectory Tessa wouldn't see coming. And then, at the very bottom, this is not revenge. This is reclamation. Sabrina Malik had been underestimated, cast aside like a relic. But they had all forgotten one thing. She didn't just build a company. She built an empire. And empires don't fall quietly. The clock on the mantel struck 2:17 a.m., but Sabrina's mind was wide awake. She sat cross-legged on the floor of her home office, surrounded by piles of papers, manila folders, and old hard drives. Her reading glasses slid down her nose as she scanned through line after line of fine print, highlighted margins, and scrawled handwritten notes. She hadn't eaten in hours. Sleep was a distant thought. Her body was exhausted, but her mind moved with razor-sharp focus. Somewhere in these stacks of contracts and legal memos lay the key. She could feel it. The silent equity clause had been a revelation, but she knew it alone wasn't enough. It gave her leverage, yes, but not control. She needed something bigger. Something undeniable. Something that could bring the entire house of cards crashing down. Then, buried between two old non-disclosure agreements, she found it. A legal memo dated 6 years ago. Its subject line was innocuous: board governance revisions, delayed execution clause. She unfolded the letter, her breath catching. Any major structural or executive changes, including CEO transitions, mergers, or board dissolutions, require prior unanimous board approval and are subject to founders' veto power until the close of fiscal year 2025. There it was. Plain as day. Sabrina had fought hard for that clause during a turbulent period of expansion, when her investors wanted safeguards, but she demanded protection against hostile interference. Most had forgotten about it, or assumed it expired with certain updates. But it hadn't. The clause had never been removed. Which meant Tessa's stunt wasn't just unethical. It was illegal. The public announcement, the vote, even the press release, none of it held legal ground. The clause rendered the entire transition null and void. And what's more, it had all been done on camera. Tessa, in her arrogance, had made her illegal power grab public, which now gave Sabrina both legal standing and public sympathy, if used wisely. She leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. This wasn't just a personal betrayal anymore. This was corporate fraud. And in the eyes of investors, regulators, and the media, that was a war crime. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts. Most of the numbers were old, disconnected, or irrelevant now. Then she paused on one entry: David Harlan, private counsel. Her private attorney. The one she had worked with off-record, separate from the company's legal team. Tessa didn't even know he existed. She called. "David," she said when he answered groggily, "I need you. Now." By 8 a.m. the next morning, David was sitting across from her in the study, dressed in jeans and a blazer, legal pad in hand. He listened silently as she explained what happened, showed him the contract, and outlined her theory. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "If this clause is valid, and from the documents, it certainly looks like it is, then the board acted outside of its authority," he said. "And if we can prove financial mismanagement under Tessa's brief reign, it strengthens the case for an emergency intervention." Sabrina smirked. "I already know where to look." Over the next several days, they began building the strike, not with rage, but with precision. David pulled legal precedents and board meeting records. Sabrina began contacting loyal former employees, those she knew still believed in her. They formed a discreet network, quietly gathering evidence of Tessa's hasty contracts, questionable expense reports, and a rushed vendor deal that raised red flags. The kind of moves an inexperienced CEO makes when they're in a rush to prove themselves. It was risky. One leak, and Tessa would catch wind. But Sabrina had played the long game before. She wasn't going to rush. Every email, every document, every footnote was collected with surgical care. Soon, they had everything they needed to trigger a legal review, one that would freeze all executive transitions pending audit, temporarily suspend the board's authority, reinstate the founders' oversight rights, launch a forensic financial investigation into the new leadership. But they weren't going to file it just yet. First, they'd leak a breadcrumb. Just enough to create doubt in the minds of the investors and board members, those same people who had turned on her. She didn't want just legal victory. She wanted public clarity. Tessa thought she had taken Sabrina's company. What she didn't know was, the founder never truly leaves.
She juste wait for the perfect moment to return.
The injunction was filed quietly, with no press release and no media circus, just a crisp, confidential envelope delivered to the court clerk and a private email sent to Malik Innovation's board of directors. But its contents were anything but quiet. The document, signed by Sabrina Malik and her attorney David Harlan, demanded an immediate freeze on all structural changes at Malik Innovations and called for an emergency review of the legality of the CEO transition. Attached were over 24 supporting documents, the founder's veto clause, evidence of procedural violations, and the beginning of what would soon become a damning financial audit of Tessa's short tenure. For the first week, there was only silence. But then it started. The company's internal servers began locking access to executive dashboards. Banking institutions paused key transfers, citing ongoing review. Vendor payments were held up. Stockholders received vague notices about temporary leadership clarifications. Inside the company, whispers turned into full-blown panic. By the end of week 2, Malik Innovations headquarters in Austin felt like a shaken hive. Middle managers scrambled to revise their budgets. Lawyers flooded Tessa's inbox. The board, so confidently unified a month ago, was now fractured, each member trying to cover their tracks and protect their assets. And Sabrina? She didn't gloat. She didn't even respond publicly. Instead, she moved with quiet, deliberate grace. Her first public appearance was at a university tech summit in Dallas. Dressed in soft gray and calm as ever, she gave a talk titled "Innovation Isn't Youth, It's Wisdom in Motion." It had nothing to do with Malik Innovations, yet every listener knew what she meant. A week later, she was photographed having coffee with 2 major venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. Then came the podcast interview with an old mentee, an emotional conversation about legacy, betrayal, and the value of building something with purpose. Clips from that episode went viral. "They tried to erase me," she said in one segment. "But I remember everything I built. So does the world." Headlines began to change. The return of the founder? Sabrina Malik, outdated or outplayed? Internal shakeups rock Malik Innovations amid legal cloud. Tessa, once hailed as a bold new leader, now looked defensive and unsteady. She called for an all-hands meeting to restore morale. But it backfired. Staff bombarded her with questions she couldn't answer. Some asked openly about the veto clause. Others demanded to know if the board's vote had truly been unanimous, or even legal. Tessa tried to hold the narrative. She launched a flashy internal rebranding campaign. She announced a new product initiative, rushed and barely viable. She doubled down on investor calls, spinning herself as the modern solution to old-world thinking. But nothing stuck. Every move she made seemed reactive, shaky, forced. Because now, every room she walked into already had a presence in it. Sabrina's. Meanwhile, the legal machinery rolled forward. David Harlan had quietly filed a secondary motion, a formal request for discovery into all board communications leading up to the CEO vote. It revealed exactly what Sabrina had suspected. Several members were misled about the legality of their decision. One board member even emailed Tessa days before the vote, raising concerns. Tessa never responded. Another blow landed when an internal audit, triggered by shareholder concerns, exposed inflated consulting fees and a conflict of interest vendor contract, both authorized by Tessa. The pressure mounted. Investors began pulling out. Staff turnover spiked. News outlets demanded comment. A former employee went on record anonymously stating, "It's chaos inside. No one knows who's in charge anymore." Still, Sabrina said nothing publicly about the case. Instead, she moved forward with patience and strategy. But she wouldn't be there for long. Moments later, the door opened again, and Sabrina Malik stepped inside. She was calm. Not smiling, not posturing. She wore a navy suit with no jewelry, hair pulled back in a neat twist.
No dramatics.
Just presence. Her steps were deliberate, steady, as she walked to the opposite end of the table and stood silently. Behind her, David Harlan and 2 senior legal representatives placed thick folders in front of each board member. The lead attorney cleared his throat. "We're here under court order to review the legality of the recent CEO transition and associated structural changes made without adherence to the governance clause in Malik Innovations' foundational charter." He turned to Sabrina. "Ms. Malik, would you proceed?" Sabrina nodded and opened her folder. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She began by reading the clause, the one hidden deep in the company's original agreements. Any executive transition or board restructuring is subject to the founder's veto until the fiscal year's end. It was there in black and white. Signed, notarized, enforceable. Tessa's face tightened. That clause is obsolete. It was written decades ago.
No, David interrupted smoothly.
It was reviewed, upheld, and reaffirmed during the 2019 compliance audit, and it remains valid under Texas corporate law. The room went still. One by one, the board members flipped through the documents in front of them, legal references, timestamps, audit confirmations. No one spoke. Then Sabrina continued, not with accusations, but with evidence. She outlined the misuse of funds under Tessa's short tenure, the inflated consultant fees, the conflict of interest vendor contract awarded to Tessa's former colleague without competitive bidding, the fast-tracked marketing campaign that burned through a 7-figure budget with zero ROI. Slide after slide, document after document. She finished with a quiet line. This company was built on integrity. She laid out a transition plan. She would not be staying. Instead, she nominated a trusted partner, Amira Chun, her longtime VP of engineering and a quiet force behind some of Malik Innovation's most successful products. Amira had the technical brilliance, the respect of the team, and most importantly, the ethics Sabrina valued above all else. I didn't build this company to die in the corner office, she told them. I built it to outlast me. The board approved her transition unanimously, and this time, genuinely. As part of the settlement agreement, Tessa's shares were revoked due to breach of fiduciary duty. The financial missteps alone had been enough to warrant legal action, but Sabrina had no interest in dragging her daughter-in-law through a public trial. She simply wanted her out of the company, and she got that, quietly and definitively. Tessa left without a press conference, without a goodbye party. The same headlines that once celebrated her takeover now referred to her as a brief interim executive, an embarrassing footnote in Malik Innovation's otherwise inspiring legacy. Ray, her son, returned one afternoon unannounced. He stood on Sabrina's porch for 10 full minutes before knocking. When she opened the door, he looked older than she remembered, more fragile, more human. I'm sorry, Oma, he said. I should have stood by you. Sabrina looked at him for a long moment. There was sadness in her eyes, but no anger. She stepped aside and let him in. They didn't talk much that day. He helped her water the garden, and she made chai the way he liked it. Forgiveness hung in the air, not spoken, but understood. Still, she didn't need his apology to move forward. She had already done that on her own. With her time at Malik Innovations officially complete, Sabrina turned her energy towards something new, something deeply personal. She launched the Malik Mentorship Fund, a non-profit initiative dedicated to supporting underrepresented female founders in the tech space. She provided seed grants, paired young entrepreneurs with experienced mentors, and offered quiet wisdom from the sidelines. I built my company from a garage, she told one eager mentee. All you need is a blueprint, and someone who believes in you. Let me be that someone. Her story began to take on a new life, not as a cautionary tale of betrayal, but as a blueprint for resilience. Articles celebrated her grace, her comeback, her legacy. She didn't fight for revenge. She fought for dignity, and won. Then came the farewell gala. Hosted by the tech community, it was part tribute, part celebration. Old employees, current staff, former rivals, investors, and ments all came together under one roof to honor her journey. There were speeches, laughter, even tears. And Sabrina, standing in a silver sari on a small stage, accepted none of the praise as personal victory, but as shared success. After the formal ceremony, during cocktail hour, a young journalist approached her. Ms. Malik, she asked hesitantly, voice barely above the music, you've been betrayed by your own family, humiliated publicly, and yet, you came back stronger.
How did you survive it all?
Sabrina looked at her, then at the bustling room, the same company she had built, nearly torn apart, and finally rebuilt. The friends who had returned. The faces of women she was now helping to rise. She gave a small, knowing smile.
Never let someone else write your ending, she said softly. Déteste the secret.
Own your story, even the ugly parts. Especially the ugly parts. The journalist nodded, speechless. And with that, Sabrina turned back toward the crowd, where laughter echoed and champagne glasses clinked. Her ending wasn't just rewritten. It was entirely her own. If you've ever been underestimated, humiliated, or pushed aside, remember, your story isn't over.
Like Sabrina, rise on your own terme.